Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, anyways, I thought that I would review this little video that I found very, very interesting by this one channel, of course, called Dante's Boxing Nation. And of course, we have reviewed quite a bit of his videos, all in all, because, like I said, Dante, I like to review certain channels, or I like to review other people's opinions, especially those that appear to be quite delusional. And I don't know if there's really any other channel out there that is quite as delusional as either Aki TV or Dante's Boxing Nation. Dante's Boxing Nation is pretty much the president of quote-unquote new media, while Aki TV, he pretty much is the vice president. So basically what that means is that they're basically the president and the vice president of delusion. But it is what it is. I'm not saying that I disagree with them on everything, but I do think that they do provide a certain amount of false narratives out there. And of course, the fighter that they try to tear down more than any other fighter out there today is, of course, Mr. Canelo Alvarez. Why is that? As I've said many, many times before, but just in case you're new to the channel, Canelo Alvarez, in my opinion, is the clear #1 pound-for-pound fighter. I don't have any other fighter ahead of him. Now, I do think that maybe Terrence Crawford could eventually catch up. Maybe him, maybe Errol Spence Jr., could be Alexander Usyk, could be Tyson Fury, could be any one of those names. Those are really the only names that, in my opinion, more than likely would have a chance to catch up with Canelo Alvarez, at least in the near future. I'm talking about within the next 2 to 3 years. Now, another name that may also be able to catch up with Canelo Alvarez in terms of skills and resume and all that other stuff, it could also be Gervonta Tank Davis, because I do think that he is very skilled. I do think that he is very talented. And if he's able to get wins over the likes of Devin Haney and Vasily Lomachenko, Ryan Garcia, and who knows, maybe even possibly Josh Taylor, Regis Prograis, and Jose Ramirez, he's going to have to be in that conversation a little bit as well. Maybe even Shakur Stevenson and Oscar Valdez, if I didn't say them already. So those are going to be the fighters, in my opinion, that more than likely are going to be in that top pound-for-pound conversation. Do I believe that they will for sure surpass Canelo Alvarez? I'm not so sure, because Canelo Alvarez, in my opinion, I'm a person that ranks things pretty logically and objectively. Like I said, I don't like to be a fan of any of these fighters or any of these athletes because I would ruin my logic and objectivity. So I'm not saying that it's impossible for some of these guys to surpass Canelo Alvarez, but it is going to be a very, very difficult task, especially if Canelo Alvarez continues facing A-grade fighters. Now, his next fight, of course, from what we know, is a fight against an African fighter by the name of Olunga Makabu. And African fighters, they don't usually tend, and I'm talking about African fighters from the continent of Africa and the countries of Africa, such as Nigeria, Ghana, Cameroon, etc. I can't really remember where Makabu is from, but from what we know, usually from boxing history, African fighters, even though they can be tough, they're not usually known for their boxing intellect and their boxing superiority. It just is what it is. But Makabu, what I will say is this. I do think that it is a very interesting fight because, like I said, I kind of place it on that similar, ranking as John Ruiz versus Roy Jones Jr. when they fought. Now, if you want to argue that Roy Jones Jr. versus John Ruiz on paper was a more competitive fight, you can argue that. I don't necessarily have a problem with that. But the reason why I say that it's along those lines is because Makabu is clearly, bigger than that of a Canelo Alvarez. But when it comes down to it, Canelo Alvarez, he is going to be favored to win this fight. He clearly is overall going to have a chance to win this fight and more than likely going to be the favorite at least 70-30. So Canelo Alvarez does have to win that fight if he wants to remain as the #1 pound-for-pound fighter. And he does have a real chance at accomplishing history in that fight, in my opinion. But Dante also is going to be talking about something else about Canelo Alvarez. In fact, he's actually going to be talking about Canelo Alvarez's possible racial biases and possibly that Canelo Alvarez may even be a racist. Which, of course, this doesn't surprise me at all. And if any of you have watched Dante's or any of the LDBC or new media channels at all, overall that this really shouldn't surprise you either, because pretty much all the LDBC and new media channels all those guys are pretty much a victimized pro-black cult. They have a very big victim-like mentality. That's why they always complain about how black fighters are picked upon and overall, how, there's so much discrimination against them. And I agree to a certain extent. I do think that black fighters to a certain degree and maybe black athletes, and of course, if you want to call them black people as a whole, when it comes down to it, there's certain discriminations against them. I don't necessarily have a problem with that. But when it comes down to it, when you're trying to spread narratives of someone being an alleged racist or certain fans overall, apparently being racist when it comes down to just because they may not applaud a certain fighter, or because all in all they may not recognize someone as the #1 pound for pound, or just because all in all they may treat this fighter differently than another one. I think you're going to need a very, very strong case for that. What Dante is going to try to allege in this video is that Canelo Alvarez seems to have racist tendencies because he does not seem to accommodate a lot of black fighters out there. Which to me, whether Canelo Alvarez is a racist or not, doesn't really matter when it comes down to it, because I don't think all in all that it really matters when I'm ranking you as a fighter. There's a lot of people out there that I would not say are great people, such as a John Jones or a Conor McGregor. But, now, of course, that's MMA, but that would not, stop me from saying that they are all-time great fighters. Personally, I think that John Jones, especially with his track record and his arrest record, I would say that he probably, to be honest with you, is probably a human piece of garbage. I don't think that Adrian Broner is a great, well, I don't think he's a great fighter anyway, but I don't think he's a great person. But, at the end of the day, he at least is a decent fighter. He's a 4-weight division champion. It just is what it is. So, it's whatever. But Dante, he's going to try to prove the point that Canelo Alvarez is an alleged racist. But I think it's going to be very interesting. We'll see what he says. Let's get into it.
Dante's Boxing Nation, what's going on, guys? So Canelo Alvarez completely disses Teofimo Lopez and excludes black people from the congratulations party. Let's get into it. So following George Kambosos' win over Teofimo Lopez to take all of his unified belts, Canelo Alvarez reaches out to George Kambosos and congratulates him, which tells us how Canelo Alvarez felt about Teofimo Lopez all along, even when Teo jumped on that stage with him.
Well, maybe, when it comes down to it. I don't know if that's a clear message that Canelo doesn't like Teofimo Lopez, but maybe perhaps he did read something on him that said maybe this kid does not take the sport as seriously as I do. I think that Canelo Alvarez tends to get annoyed, and I think all in all that he has a hard time respecting a certain amount of the other boxers out there, because I think he takes a look at them, and not only does he say that they're not as great as me, but he says they don't train as hard as me, they don't want it as hard as me. So a lot of these other Latino fighters, or even certain other fighters of other demographics, he may look at them and he may say, yeah, you're decent, but you're not on my level. You don't want it as hard as I do. I don't see you doing the same work that I do. I think that Canelo Alvarez, someone looks at it that way. I think that's why he went off on Ryan Garcia about a month ago. At least that's when I heard about it, at least, where he basically told Ryan Garcia that, you're very talented, but you don't work that hard in the gym. You're more worried about your Instagram followers than you are boxing. Now, whether that's true or not, who knows? But it's very clear, in my opinion, that Canelo Alvarez, he has a very high standard for himself and for those around him. And I think that that's a great thing, because that often leads you and others around you being successful.
Claiming that he was undisputed. Now, I had already made a video where I had told you guys that Canelo Alvarez, he made it clear that Teo was not undisputed, because he said historically there are only 6 people that have ever became undisputed, and that list did not include Lopez's name. That's what Canelo said right after he beat.
And I would agree with that. So anyone overall that is saying that Teofimo Lopez was not undisputed, at least completely undisputed, they have the full right to say that, because of course Teofimo Lopez, he did not fight Devin Haney. Now, whether he was not willing to or did not want to when it came down to it, that's your business. That's up to you. Personally, in my opinion, it did look like maybe Teofimo was not super interested in that fight, but it is what it is. Teofimo was not completely undisputed. Yes, we can say that. It is what it is. The only recently undisputed fighters that I can think of have been Alexander Usyk. I'm trying to think overall of who else. Josh Taylor, of course, Terrence Bud Crawford, and of course Canelo Alvarez. Those are the only ones that have been completely unified, at least from the top of my memory.
Caleb Plant.
And I know some people are going to, bitch, moan, and complain about Canelo and say, oh, well, you can't say that he was undisputed because he never beat the true WBC champion, David Benavidez. At the end of the day, David Benavidez didn't have the belt. Now, do I want to see the David Benavidez fight? Yes, I do. But when it comes down to it, at the end of the day, David Benavidez was irresponsible, and he was caught on a banned substance. This is also my opinion. Do I believe that David Benavidez, because people say, oh, well, it was a substance that, was found overall, to be positive for cocaine or something like that. sometimes that can be used overall to test negative for other PEDs. So, do I believe that David Benavidez more than likely is on some sort of PEDs? Yes, I do. Now, do I also believe that Canelo Alvarez is more than likely on some sort of performance enhancer? More than likely, yes. But it is what it is. But like I said, it is what it is to me because a lot of these guys, a lot of these boxers, a lot of these athletes in general, I don't care what sport it is, this is my opinion. I think a lot of these athletes, no matter what sport you watch, especially in the U.S. and other, sports like that are very popular in the U.S. and other big countries, a lot of these athletes are on steroids, period. Just is what it is.
Now, after Teofimo, he loses to the 13-1 underdog George Kambosos. He blames his loss on everyone except for himself and his father. He blamed it on the zone. He blamed it on the judge. He said he was robbed. Canelo could have stayed on code just because Teofimo Lopez is Latino, and Teo, he looks up to Canelo Alvarez. Canelo could have easily just said whatever Lopez wanted to hear to make him feel better, but instead, it was the contrary. He came out and said, congratulations to Kambosos, meaning he didn't take anything serious that Lopez...
I agree, and he shouldn't have taken anything that Teofimo Lopez said serious because it was all delusion. And I have respect for Teofimo Lopez. I have respect for any fighters out there, no matter what their personal convictions are or what their thought process is. I have respect for any fighter out there because, of course, it takes a lot of courage and a lot of gall to go in the ring and try to be great at something, especially in boxing where, you could possibly get your ass kicked. So I have a lot of respect for Teofimo Lopez, but he was acting like a biatch after that fight, making all those excuses. And, some people may ask, well, do you believe that Teofimo Lopez truly believed in those excuses? I'm not necessarily sure. I think maybe at the first, maybe he did, but I think once he heard the crowd booing and, maybe he watched some highlights later on and all that stuff, I think he probably knew more than likely that he just lost that fight. It is what it is. I don't think that he truly thinks that he won 10 rounds to 2, and if he did, he's goddamn delusional. He's out of his mind. Because there's no way that you could have won 10 rounds in a fight to where you really barely threw anything, even compared to George Kambosos. And that was the biggest surprise to me because I really thought Teofimo was going to win that fight just by being just more active. That's how he defeated Vasyl Lomachenko. But he was not even more active than a George Kambosos. And that's a big no-no. That's a big mistake on his part because George Kambosos, you can beat him on activity. Because Kambosos, sometimes, just like Teofimo Lopez or Devin Haney, he kind of relies on counterpunching ability a little bit too much. And he's not someone overall that's a Floyd Mayweather. He's not someone all in all that I would say is like an Erislandy Lara or someone that has a 50 punch percentage, landing percentage. So you can actually beat him based on activity, but he threw even less because George Kambosos was boxing his face off the whole entire night. Don't get me wrong, it was competitive. But Teofimo, he really overall not only should have been more active, but his defense should have been a hell of a lot better. His feet should have been better. His head movement should have been way better. He boxed a really bad fight.
As junior or senior said after the fight, which no one in the boxing world did, including diehard Teofimo Lopez fans. Now let's talk about Canelo Alvarez excluding black people from the party, black fighters from the congratulations party, I should say. Listen, now when Canelo Alvarez is congratulating another countryman, like Montiel after his performance against Jamal Charlo. But then when Canelo Alvarez, he starts to congratulate fighters that are not Mexican, like fighters from Australia, George Kambosos, over Latino fighters. And there are a lot of black fighters, they don't pay attention to racial double standards. They just go off of what they see old media saying. And a lot of black fighters, they are all...
I highly doubt that, Dante. I'm not really believing that one. Dante always tries to spread this narrative that, and I think the reason why he tries to spread it is because there's a lot of black fighters that recognize that Canelo Alvarez, that he's the real deal. It just is what it is. Now, some people out there, they'll say that Canelo is ducking and dodging and avoiding. It is what it is. And once again, do I think that Canelo may do some maneuvering here and there? Yeah, but when you really take a look at Canelo Alvarez, especially in like his last about 20 fights, Canelo has, on average, fought A-grade competition at least about 75% of the time. It just is what it is. Dante always tries to spread this narrative about how black fighters, they're so magnanimous and, overall, they're so giving towards other demographics. We all know that's bullshit because when Vasyl Lomachenko was ranked as the #1 pound-for-pound fighter, who was the main demographic that was trying to tear down Lomachenko? It wasn't the Latinos. It wasn't the Asians. It wasn't the Middle Easterns. We all know what demographic was mainly trying to tear down Lomachenko. It was the black demographic. It just is what it is. And I get it to a certain degree because there can be certain things known as great white hypes. But with Vasily Lomachenko, he was a real deal fighter. And it's the same thing with Canelo. But Canelo is even greater, at least so far, than a Vasily Lomachenko.
Seen Canelo Alvarez. Fighters like Shakur Stevenson, who at least in the past...
And Dante always says this bullshit about how fighters, they don't pay attention to the double standard. That's a bunch of horseshit because Devin Haney, he's talked about many times about how he believes black fighters are discriminated against. Terrence Crawford has said something about it. Shakur Stevenson has said something about it. Gervonta Tank Davis has said something about it. Deontay Wilder has always talked about it. That's why they loved him so much, because he basically was the Black Panther wannabe and the pro-black king when it came down to it. That's basically why they loved Deontay Wilder so much, because he basically was their version of Muhammad Ali. And I was right on the money with that, because 78 Sports TV, he was quoted as saying that overall in an interview.
He's praised him. Gervonta Tank Davis actually wanted Canelo Alvarez to walk out with him in the Mario Barrios fight, and Canelo Alvarez declined. They revealed at the press conference talking to Floyd Mayweather that
It's very clear to me that Gervonta Tank Davis, that Gervonta Tank Davis more than likely is a very, very big Canelo Alvarez fan. He wanted to wear his gloves, and he says that he watches a lot of his fights, and he says that he admires Canelo Alvarez and that he looks at himself as the Canelo Alvarez of the lower weight classes. I think Gervonta Tank Davis is a very, very big fan of Canelo Alvarez. I think that he loves watching him fight. I think that he loves watching his fights. I think overall that he just loves everything about Canelo. I think he takes a look at him and he really admires the fighter that Canelo Alvarez is.
Gervonta even wanted to wear Canelo boxing gloves, and Floyd Mayweather had to talk him out of it. I have the clip, but I'm just going to explain the story. Floyd Mayweather, he told Gervonta, why are you going to wear the gloves of a man that's rooting against you? So finally, at the last minute...
Well, is Canelo Alvarez really rooting against Gervonta Tank Davis? I mean, we all know Dante, he's already basically poisoned with that victim mentality when it comes down to it. So we all know Dante, we all know what he's going to say. But if we take a look at, reality, is Canelo really against black fighters? Does he really have something against them? Now, maybe he does. Who knows? I don't know Canelo Alvarez really as a person. I can, from what I've seen, I can try to digest and, give you my analyzation. But I don't know him personally. I don't know what he's like behind closed doors. You really don't know who anyone is like behind closed doors until you've been with them personally in a situation behind closed doors. And I don't know necessarily, what Canelo Alvarez's deal is. But it's not his job to support every black fighter out there. It's not his job to say, great job, Devin Haney, for defeating Jojo Diaz. It's not his job to say, great job, Gervonta Tank Davis, for beating, Isaac Cruz. That's not his job. Canelo Alvarez can, thank, admire, accommodate whoever he wants to. You don't see Deontay Wilder, who was a big pro-black fighter. You don't see him giving a whole bunch of congratulations to a bunch of Caucasian or Latino fighters. At least not usually. At least from what I've seen. Now, if I'm wrong about that, someone correct me. But that's just personally from what I've seen. Have we seen Terrence Crawford give a lot of credit to any of these Caucasian or other Latino fighters? Now, maybe he does. I don't know. My point being is this. I don't know why Dante says that some of these other demographics, like the Caucasians or the Latino fighters, that they should be giving praise overall to black fighters. Why? Because let's be real. The majority of black fighters out there, it's not like they're just kissing Canelo Alvarez's ass. And I'm not saying that you have to kiss his ass. But Dante, all in all, he tries to make this narrative to where every black fighter talks positively about Canelo. That's not true. Shakur Stevenson and Floyd Mayweather and, a lot of black fighters out there, Terrence Crawford, a lot of black fighters out there have said something derogatory about Canelo Alvarez. Now, have there been some black fighters like Gervonta Tank Davis and Jamel Charlo that have said something positive about him or something in a positive light? Yeah, sure. But just because that happens doesn't mean that Canelo Alvarez has to go out of his way to say, great job, black fighters. He doesn't have to do that. Just like Deontay Wilder, when Alexander Usyk beat Anthony Joshua, how come Deontay Wilder didn't congratulate Alexander Usyk? Is Deontay, excuse me, is Deontay Wilder a racist because he did not, think Alexander Usyk? Now, in my opinion, more than likely, Deontay Wilder, with his mindset, he probably does have some racist tendencies, but it is what it is. Like I said, I don't really give a shit about that because I'm ranking you as a fighter and I'm ranking you overall, blah, 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 basically within the boxing ranking system on my pound for pound list. So, my pound for pound list, I don't really give a shit overall what you do in your personal life. What you do there is your business. Now, if I'm trying to break you down as a person, then of course, then maybe I might do that. But like I said, I don't know why Dante, he always gives you this spiel about how you should protect black fighters and how you should talk positively about them. Dante, not only overall do a certain amount of black fighters talk negatively about Canelo Alvarez out there, but you talk negatively about him. You talk negatively about most high-level Caucasian and Latino fighters. It just is what it is. So I don't know why you're telling other demographics to stick up for black fighters when you're not going to stick up for any other demographics. At the end of the day, the Caucasians are going to stick up for the Caucasians. The blacks are going to stick up for the blacks and the Latinos are going to stick up for the Latinos. This is how it works. And it doesn't matter what sport it is. It is what it is.
Gervonta decides not to wear Canelo Alvarez's gloves.
Now, some people might make the point, well, that's cool, but why is Canelo Alvarez overall, congratulating George Kambosos, but he didn't congratulate Devin Haney or Gervonta Tank Davis on their win? That shows that he's clearly a racist. Well, does that really show that Canelo Alvarez is a racist? Or does that really show that Canelo Alvarez knows the weight of winning over a top 10 pound-for-pound fighter versus just a top contender? Because Teofimo Lopez was one of the top 10 pound-for-pound fighters at the time, while Isaac Cruz and Jojo Diaz, sure, they're decent fighters, but no one looks at those guys as A-grade fighters. Teofimo was an undefeated, unified champion. Now, he wasn't completely unified, but he had 3 out of the 4 major belts. So, of course, getting a win like that, especially that being the first definitive A-grade win in your career, of course, that's way bigger than Gervonta Tank Davis defeating Isaac Cruz or Devin Haney defeating Jojo Diaz, 2 fighters that have already lost in their career, and 2 fighters that really, overall, I'm not going to say that they've been subpar, but, that are just good. They're not great. So, I mean, it is what it is.
You have Jermell Charlo, who's taken on way tougher competition than Canelo Alvarez. He elected to fight Casano in...
Not really. The only A-grade fighter that Jermell Charlo has ever really fought definitively in his career has been Brian Castano. And surprisingly, or not so surprisingly, depending on who you are, he had the toughest fight of his life. And to be honest with you, probably should have lost that fight. It was scored a draw, but I don't think that it was really that good of a draw. Basically, when you have a draw, especially with a controversial fight like that, that just means overall that they're really trying to protect the money fighter. They did the same thing with Canelo in the first Gennady Golovkin fight, and they did the same thing with Jermell Charlo overall versus Brian Castano, because no way in hell, in my opinion, did Jermell Charlo really deserve a draw in that fight, but it is what it is.
Rematch, that's his very next fight. He could have easily walked away from the rematch, just like Canelo walked away from the Lara fight, or the Lara rematch. But instead, Jermell...
Right, but let's talk about the Lara match here for a second. Now, of course, the Lara match was very, very competitive. But at the end of the day, that fight was not a draw. And if we are going to even talk about Lara, let's give Canelo Alvarez credit in the first place for facing someone like an Araceli Lara. Because he could have been like a Demetrius Andrade or any of the Charlo brothers and pretty much ducked and avoided Araceli Lara. At least Canelo Alvarez eventually fought Araceli Lara. And at the time, he ended up getting the decision. Now, if you want to say that it was a bit controversial, that's your business. It is what it is. I think personally it was probably a little bit controversial as well. But after rewatching it at this time, you could say that maybe Lara could have threw more in that fight. I understand the people that say Lara won the fight. I understand the people that say Canelo won the fight. I do. It is what it is, because maybe you could argue that Lara should have threw more in certain spots. So it is what it is. Depending on who you ask, the opinions will vary. But when it comes down to it, all in all, if we're also being real about Lara, most fighters, actually no fighter in his career rematched him besides Vanes Martirosyan. So like I said, I'll give Canelo Alvarez at least credit for facing Araceli Lara and somehow being able to get the split decision over him. Now, I thought that last scorecard, 9 rounds to 3 for Canelo, was a bit outrageous, but, it is what it is. Because there was other fighters that barely beat Araceli Lara or probably got a bad decision over him, and they didn't rematch him either. You know, Vanes Martirosyan, he was the only one that ever rematched Lara because really, I mean, he had to at that point in time. Lara was the, champion, and Vanes Martirosyan was at the down point of his career. But Paul Williams, when he got that complete robbery over Erislandy Lara, he didn't rematch him. When Jarrett Hurd barely beat Lara, and in my opinion, probably should have lost to him, even though I can't claim that it was a robbery because it was super close, he didn't rematch Erislandy Lara. So, like I said, let's give Canelo Alvarez some credit here for at least facing him the first time and somehow being able to pull off the decision. It is what it is. And, what I would compare the Jermell Charlo versus Brian Castano fight to, and I wouldn't even compare it completely like this, but you would compare it more to the Gennady Golovkin rematch. Because he basically had to rematch that guy. Now, if a person gets a draw against a person and then they don't want to do the rematch, that tells me that more than likely they don't have the confidence overall in winning that fight. But Canelo was able to rematch Golovkin, and in my opinion, he clearly won in a close competitive fight, but I thought Canelo Alvarez won.
He's willing to take one of the most dangerous fights in all of boxing right now. Matter of fact, I did a poll, and I asked you guys, who had the toughest fight coming up? And it was out of all of the fighters from Canelo Alvarez to Devin Haney, Gervonta, and then it was Jermell versus Castano too. And you guys overwhelmingly picked Jermell Charlo versus Castano too. So while...
Yes, that is true, and I've seen those results, and I've seen that poll. But Dante, you should also release the information that the Canelo Alvarez versus Makabu fight actually was ranked in second place. So, obviously, Canelo Alvarez, at least in a lot of people's opinions, now, of course, just because a whole bunch of people agree on something doesn't mean that, it's always correct. But when it comes down to it all in all, obviously, there's a certain amount of people that do believe that Canelo is facing A-grade competition. Now, Makabu, in my opinion, once again, he's not an A-grade fighter, but he's a natural cruiserweight. That's what makes that fight so interesting.
Fighters like Jermell Charlo and Shakur Stevenson are going after the most dangerous fighters. These fighters are showing Canelo Alvarez a lot of respect. And like I told you guys, they're doing it for two reasons. Because this...
Well, if they're showing him a lot of respect, I certainly haven't heard it. I haven't heard Stephen Fulton, and I haven't heard overall Terrence Crawford, and, where are all these black fighters besides Gervonta Tank Davis? Where are all these black fighters giving credit to Canelo Alvarez? Is Anthony Joshua, Deontay Wilder, Stephen Fulton, Shakur Stevenson, Terrence Crawford, Errol Spence Jr., are these guys completely giving praise to Canelo Alvarez on a constant basis? Come on. Dante is basically trying to allege, well, Canelo Alvarez, he owes something overall to certain black fighters to, be respectful towards them, or he's clearly a racist because so many of them respect him and he's not showing respect back. But in all reality, really, if we want to go there, at least this is the way that I view it. Now, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. If you guys have any examples you want to show me, I have no problem being proved wrong, as long as there's some substance. But this is the way that I view it. The majority of black fighters out there are usually more against Canelo Alvarez than what they are for him. Besides the exception of Gervonta Tank Davis and maybe a couple of other fighters, what black fighters are usually on the mountaintops screaming, saying, "Great job, Canelo Alvarez"? Not very many.
This is what they hear old media say. They don't pay attention to everything that goes on, and they also pay attention to their social media accounts. They want to avoid all of these racist Canelo Alvarez fans filling up their comment section. Perfect example, Stephen Fulton, one of the best fighters in the world, a champion. Before Caleb Plant fought Canelo, he said, "Let's go, champ," to the American fighter Caleb Plant, and Canelo Alvarez fans, they called him a monkey for it. This is the reason why a lot of black fighters, once again, they try to avoid saying...
Let's also be real here, and a certain amount of people may not get this, but a certain amount of people may cheer for whoever opponent is for Canelo Alvarez because they want him to lose, because they don't like him, and maybe they don't like Latino fighters, and a certain amount of people may realize that. But of course, also, do you have a certain amount of racist fans overall that maybe will call, black fighters derogatory terms? Of course. That's not me to say that that doesn't exist. Of course it does. But like I said, let's be real. Dante is trying to make the case that black fighters give so much respect to everybody else and, no one shows them any respect. That's a bunch of horse shit. Because once again, we all know how they reacted to Lomachenko debatably being number one pound per pound. And now that Canelo Alvarez is number one pound per pound, Once again, I'm not saying that some of them aren't giving him compliments like Jamel Charlo and Gervonta Tank Davis, but how many times have I heard Shakur Stevenson or Terrence Crawford or Jamal Charlo or Demetrius Andrade or a whole bunch? Now, Charlo and Andrade, they're a little bit more understandable because they're in Canelo Alvarez's own weight division. So that's a little bit understandable why would they want to give him praise. But even fighters in other divisions like Spence, he may be a common opponent later of him as well, so maybe that's more understandable. But even Crawford. Now, Crawford has talked about facing Canelo, but I'm not really sure how serious he is. My point being is this. How many legitimate black fighters, especially from America, have we heard really give Canelo Alvarez praise? Has Deontay Wilder or Anthony Joshua or Shakur Stevenson or, a certain amount of these other black fighters, have they usually, let's be real, have they usually given Canelo Alvarez props, or have they usually been trying to tear him down more often? It just is what it is.
Anything true about Canelo Alvarez that happens to be negative in their eyes. Because a lot of these black fighters, when they see these racist comments and all the hate from Canelo Alvarez fans, they immediately start saying, damn, what did I say wrong? I apologize. Whatever I said wrong, I apologize, because once again, I'm going to keep saying this. A lot of these black boxers, they don't pay attention to the racial double standards. They just want everyone to like them on their social media accounts. Now, this is not to say that Canelo Alvarez is not a good fighter, because we know that he's a good fighter. But it goes to show you that while fighters like Jamel...
Canelo is not just a good fighter, he is an all-time great fighter. He is a great fighter. Canelo Alvarez, in my opinion, as I've already stated, especially if he keeps going the way that he's going, he is at least going to be within my top 30 of all time. If he keeps doing what he's doing, he may even reach my top 10. Like I said, in my opinion, Julio Cesar Chavez, he probably is the greatest Mexican fighter of all time. As of right now, I have Canelo Alvarez at number 2. That means that he's in very great company.
Charlo, Shakur Stevenson, Stephen Fulton are going after the most dangerous opponents available. They're showing Canelo respect at the same time, and in return...
Well, they're going after people all in all that are champions in their divisions, but so is Canelo Alvarez. I mean, does anyone really think that Brandon Figueroa, or whatever the hell his name is, I believe it's Brandon Figueroa, is Brandon Figueroa really that much greater of a fighter than Caleb Plant? I don't think he's a better fighter at all. I think Caleb Plant is more talented for his division. I think all in all that he was an all-around better fighter. So, I mean, it's no offense against the Figueroa brothers, but they're pretty much punching bags with power. That's pretty much what they are. It is what it is. And from what I heard, Fulton had a hell of a time with Figueroa, but I'd have to take a look at it. I didn't watch the fight for myself. But it is what it is. And then you talk about Gervonta Tank Davis and Devin Haney. Don't get me wrong, Jojo Diaz and Isaac Cruz, they're okay fighters, but they're not great fighters. Canelo Alvarez was facing guys that they're decent threats, like Caleb Plant and Billy Joe Saunders. Now, some people may disagree, and let's say, oh, what about Charlo? What about Andre? What about Benavidez? Of course, I think those fights need to happen, but like I said, Caleb Plant, Billy Joe Saunders, and Callum Smith, they're somewhat along those lines. Some people may disagree, but like I said, all those fighters, I can pretty much point out to you what their faults are, what their strengths, what their weaknesses are. It is what it is. They're all on that A-grade line, but none of them are A-plus fighters. At least none of them are on the Canelo level, in my opinion.
Canelo Alvarez has never congratulated or reached out and congratulated to not one single black fighter for getting a win. And I'm talking...
And why does he need to? Why does he need to? Why is that a requirement? It's not Canelo Alvarez's job to accommodate every single black fighter out there. So it is what it is. And I love how Dante, excuse me, he always bitches, moans, and complains about how people don't, protect black fighters, or, they won't say good things about them. Dante, maybe before overall people start doing that, maybe overall you should learn to be a little bit more logical and objective and give certain Caucasian and other Latino fighters some credit. Because on average, 90% of the time, I've usually seen Dante tear down more Caucasian and Latino fighters than what he's trying to uplift. The only ones that he's really giving credit to, and the only ones that he's really calling A grade, are the fighters that, when it comes down to it, he realizes that, let me just say this, it's pretty much going to have a benefit for him later on down the line. What do I mean by that? If it's a Caucasian fighter overall that he sees that could possibly lose to a very good black American fighter, to where basically he can promote that black fighter even on a higher level because he were able to beat that Caucasian or Latino fighter, then he'll give him a great amount of credit. That's why they like Josh Taylor so much, because they know that if Josh Taylor moves up to 147, more than likely he's not going to beat Errol Spence Jr. or Terrence Bud Crawford. But overall, if he did have a decent chance, I'm telling you what, and if Josh Taylor was in the discussion as debatably being the #1 pound-for-pound fighter, they wouldn't like him as much.
Now, since Canelo Alvarez lost to Floyd Mayweather to become a star, because that's his biggest claim to fame is losing to Floyd Mayweather. I mean, do you guys know how long ago that fight?
And of course, Dante's Boxing Nation clear disrespect of Canelo Alvarez. You know, the biggest claim to fame that he has is losing to Mayweather. Well, there's a lot of fighters out there that you can claim their biggest claim to fame is losing to Floyd Mayweather. You can claim that that's Miguel Cotto's biggest claim to fame, Manny Pacquiao, Shane Mosley's. But the bottom line is this: Floyd Mayweather Jr., he's an all-time great fighter, and he was the clear #1 pound-for-pound of his day. So I'm not really going to get on Canelo Alvarez's ass for losing that big fight too much. Now, the people that I do get on, you know, for losing the bigger fights, maybe people like a Deontay Wilder, because you had somewhat of an even chance to beat Tyson Fury, or an Adrian Broner, or someone like a Vasily Lomachenko when he lost to Teofimo Lopez. If the fight is somewhat along of a 50-50 line, then, you know, you should be able to pull out that fight. Because sports and life in general, a lot of the times, is being able to pull out of the big moments, being able to live up to the pressure, and live up to the hype. It is what it is. And Canelo, I mean, let's be real, besides the Mayweather fight, the majority of the time he's been able to live up to the hype. Yes, there's been a couple of other controversial decisions, like against Lara and Golovkin, but you can argue that he also won those fights as well, at least the second fight against Golovkin. So it is what it is.
When he lost to Floyd Mayweather? That was way back in, what, 2013, 2014? So we're talking about 7-8 years. Canelo Alvarez has never reached out to one single black fighter to say congratulations on your win. But he does it for Cambosis. See, unlike Canelo, in the many races...
So that means that he's a racist? It is what it is. So once again, Dante, how many times overall has, you know, Deontay Wilder gone out of his way to congratulate a Caucasian or Latino fighter? Now, we know that he did it with Andrew Ruiz, but we all know overall why he congratulated Andrew Ruiz, because he defeated Anthony Joshua, a person that Deontay Wilder, you know, very much hated and wanted to basically try to tear down his career. As the old saying goes, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. That's the only reason why Deontay Wilder gave Andrew Ruiz credit. I haven't heard Deontay Wilder stick up for any other Caucasian or Latino fighter, period. Does that mean that Deontay Wilder is a racist? Now, in my opinion, he has a very big racial bias. But it is what it is. Like I said, it's not a mandatory thing for Canelo Alvarez to stick up for any black fighter. You know, you shouldn't be concerned with that.
This is Canelo Alvarez fans, all of the race fans. I practice what I preach. This is what...
No, you don't, Dante. Just stop. You hear this, man? I practice what I preach. You know how many videos overall that I've reviewed showing this dude's clear racial bias and racism? Dante is probably debatably the biggest racist out there, besides maybe Aki TV and 78 Sports TV. I mean, 78 Sports TV, he's on he's on like a whole nother level. But, you know, a lot of these other guys, you know, no, you don't practice what you preach.
I love about YouTube, everything that I said, everything that all of us have said and posted on the internet, it has been documented. And what you will see is me praising and giving credit to every fighter that got a big win, no matter what their race is.
Well, then why do you tear down Canelo Alvarez every single time that he gets a big win? Why do you tear down him basically every single time that he beats Caleb Plant or he beats Billy Joe Saunders? And Dante, let's be real. No, you don't overall give them credit every time they get big wins, especially if they're a Caucasian or Latino fighter. And if you don't believe me, go ahead and check out a certain amount of my other videos, especially the Tyson Fury versus Deontay Wilder ones, or Canelo Alvarez versus Jamal Charlo possibly being next. All Dante does is make excuses for the fighters that he likes, or makes excuses as to why not to rank those Caucasian or Latino fighters on a higher level. Yeah, well, Tyson Fury, he defeated Deontay Wilder, but we all know that Tyson Fury has never defeated that complete of a fighter. He never really has had that great a competition, or Gennady Golovkin was a hype job, Vasily Lomachenko was overstated, or, you know, when it comes down to it, he don't give credit to any of those guys. Now, once again, he'll give credit to Josh Taylor. he'll give credit overall to Jeff Horn because he knows overall that them boys are pretty much going to get their ass whooped when they finally meet an A-plus fighter. But he ain't going to give credit overall to the big boys. He ain't going to give credit to the people that could debatably be eventually a #1 pound-for-pound fighter. He's not going to give credit to them.
Black to Mexican, white, and everything else in between.
And even with Canelo Alvarez, when he was apparently supposed to face Jamal Charlo next, at least that's what we were debating. You know, that's what we were somewhat expecting. What did Dante try to say? Basically, to put an excuse out there. Oh, well, you know, Canelo Alvarez, he's facing Jamal Charlo, and I think he'll face him because he had his worst performance. Is that really giving Canelo Alvarez credit? Or is that you basically trying to put an, shoehorn an excuse in there?
But these fans on the internet, I can guarantee you, 95% of them have never in their life went on the internet to congratulate, praise, or defend a black fighter when it was warranted.
Well, before those people start doing that, Dante, why don't you start praising more Caucasian and Latino fighters before you start talking that shit? Because I've watched a certain amount of your videos, and the majority of the time when a Caucasian or Latino fighter gets a great win, you ain't giving them that much credit. So let's just stop the bullshit.
Now we know that Canelo Alvarez has never reached out to one single black fighter in the last 7 to 8 years that he's become a star in the sport of boxing. Let me tell you guys something else about Canelo you guys probably don't know or don't remember. Leading up to the Mayweather versus Canelo fight in All Access, of course, Floyd Mayweather.
You know, there's a bunch of people overall that give praise to Julio Cesar Chavez. Floyd Mayweather Jr. overall has given praise to him. There's a certain amount of Caucasian fighters that have given praise to him, and a certain amount of possibly even other demographics. But I haven't heard Julio go out of his way to say that Mayweather is a great fighter or anything like that. Does that mean that Chavez Sr. is a racist? Or does that mean that, he just doesn't want to do it? Who the hell cares? Or does that mean maybe he just didn't hear anything about it? Once again, Dante, he's really trying to allege something here, but it's kind of a straw man argument.
He's promoting a fight. He's taking little digs at Canelo Alvarez. He's calling him Blake Griffin. Blake Griffin, for those of you guys who don't know, is a black redhead basketball player, right? He also called him the kid from the Mad magazine. Clearly, he's making fun of him being a redhead. Now, Canelo Alvarez, in return, he says...
Yes, he's making fun of him being a redhead, but let's also understand that Canelo Alvarez is Mexican. Now, of course, he does have Caucasian roots, but I'm sure that Canelo Alvarez has had a certain amount of problems with people somewhat racially, I'm not going to say tormenting him, but racially kind of antagonizing him, basically saying that you're more Caucasian than you are Mexican. You ain't even Mexican, you're a white boy. So, I'm not saying overall that, it's great to be derogatory back, but all I'm saying is this. Maybe overall, if you don't want anything coming back at you, maybe you should shut your damn mouth in the first place.
Now, if I say something about him, everyone is going to be offended. What did Canelo mean by that? What could you possibly say about Floyd Mayweather that would be taken seriously and people are all offended about it? We know exactly what he means when he says that. Canelo Alvarez, he's saying that if he says something about Floyd Mayweather, it's going to be serious. And it ain't going to be no light stuff that Floyd Mayweather said. This is no different than when Adrian Broner, he kidded Mikey Garcia by calling him Mickey Mouse. He was calling him Mickey Mouse because he was making fun of his name. No different than when Adrian Broner was fighting against Paulie Malignaggi, he started calling him Paulina, right? So Broner, he calls Mikey Garcia Mickey Mouse, and Mikey, he takes things to a whole nother level. In return, he puts up an image on his Instagram of Mickey Mouse and Donkey Kong, a gorilla, as Adrian Broner. This is no different than the Jack Johnson situation when he was fighting for the heavyweight title against Tommy Burns.
I only kidded him in a nice way, but he used the other sort of language. If I had killed Burns for the language he used to me, I would have been fully justified.
That's all I got for now, guys.
Like I said, man, I'm not saying that, like I said, racist terms are okay. But at the end of the day, maybe if you don't want things coming back at you, you should probably shut your mouth in the first place. It is what it is.
Let's move on to the next one. Fellas, I've got
But anyways, that's really about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching. We'll see overall what happens with Mr. Canelo Alvarez. Of course, I'm very excited for his next fight against Makabu because I think that is a history accomplisher if he's able to get past him. But we'll see what happens. Anyways, that's really about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll talk to you all later.